Trying to find ways to improve in life itself, but in video games, can be tricky. In fact, it can be the very devil. And what is the devil? But your doubts, those nagging insecurities that tell you you're not improving. You know, if you have a good game, that's just a one-off. You're going to revert back. You're going to regress to the mean. The frustrations of trying to do things, trying to copy players you think are better. Boomeo has some solutions for you. They have guides, including video assets to show you what players mean when they're explaining something to you. They have a bunch of different server modes. They have the duels mod, where you warm up in a bunch of different spots, 1v1, and then switch after every death or kill. They have the pre-fire mod, which is one of the newest ones that you're going to check out, and you can see some videos online of it. They have the server browser, where they have their own version that you can find better servers than just the default one that Valve provides for you inside CSGO. Now, speaking of the devil, the Beelzebub, as he were, or if you were to say it the way that this player did, Beelzebub, Norwegian, and hit shortened then to Biesel, shortened to BSL, because that was the old way you used to do aliases there as you kept playing with them. Now, he's a player who had a long career in 1.6 and was around esports for many, many years in the 2000s, going into early 2010, but has spent the last few years as a professional journalist in Norway, working from an office, working for big newspapers. But it's been announced today, well, at least when I'm making this video, that he is making his return to esports. He is getting a job at ESL, Electronic Sports League, we all know them, and in some capacity he's going to be coming back to esports. So with CSGO being so huge, it'll certainly be interesting to see if he plays a role there. But let's talk about his career and who he was as a player. Now, first of all, when I used to work many years ago for ESEA, and particularly when I made a little return there, I actually wrote an article about BSL's career where I did it wasn't the most in-depth, but I cover the big periods of it, and I'll link that in the description box below. Now, we have to go way back in time to 2002 to get the storyline for BSL, because he first popped up in a Norwegian team called Meredia, and he was the in-game leader of this team. Famously, it had Element, who at the time was just a young rookie, and they actually had a Swedish player play for them at the time who'd played in Game Online before, one of the top Swedish teams called Gozi. And this team is most famous for a big upset win at a Norwegian line called GameSphere. And GameSphere, because they offered $10,000 on paper, that's what they said they were offering as the first prize, they attracted some top world competition to come to this LAN. You had Game Online, who'd finished third at the last big CPL, and who'd taken in Vestlund, who was the famous in-game leader of Mafia, and who was actually playing for NIP, the team that had won the big major CPL winter 2001. Then, and they were trialing Vestlund at the time to see if he would become the new in-game leader of the team. Then they had Massive Attack, who was the best Norwegian team and who had placed fourth at that previous CPL and had the likes of Dark in the lineup, obviously a very legendary player from that region, and particularly at that time one of the best players. And these two teams were the heavy favourites to win this LAN, but actually it was Meredia who won the LAN. Now, BSL wasn't actually playing at that LAN. He'd been in the team before. Instead, he'd been unavailable for this particular LAN. But that big result particularly not only got everyone's attention that they'd upset these big teams, but obviously launched Element. And Element quickly was snapped up by Game Online and would later go on to play in CPL finals, become one of the all-time great players. But he'd been with BSL in the early days. Now the rest of the team, though, that he had at the time was obviously still a quality team. They'd managed this big upset. So BSL comes back and they get sponsorship from, I think it was a cafe at the time, and they become Team Spacebar. And so while Element's off in Game Online going his run in the summer, they go to the tournaments as well, and they get some sponsorship to go there. So they go to LAN Arena in France, famously a tournament with a lot of problems. They don't manage to crack the top 10 there. They come, well, they placed 9th to 12th, so I guess they technically did, but they didn't get a deep finish there. They go over to the big CPL, the next big major, CPL Summer in the summer of 2002, and they unfortunately lost a Game Online in the upper bracket with Element. And in the lower bracket, they made it all the way through to a matchup to decide if they'd crack top 8 against Gamers X. And this Gamers X team was actually a very skilled team. It was the one that had Steelin, the Canadian player from Bulgaria, who goes on to join Team 3D. They had Method in the team, the very skilled player who would later on be in teams, well, more obviously other Gamers X lineups, but most famously in Weekend Warriors. And he was also later in Team 3D and obviously in NOA later on with BSL. And was actually a pretty skilled kind of mixed team lineup for that tournament. And they lost to this team only in overtime and on Clan Mill. And Clan Mill was the map which later, the same layout, became Tuscan many years later. But famously, because it was CPL, because it was Clan Mill, it was actually owned by the CPL. So the only tournaments it was used in was Cal, the online league for the CPL, but in America, and American CPLs. So actually Europeans never had it and Europeans never practiced it. So the fact that they almost beat this team there and cracked top 8 shows that they were actually probably a better team and that they did pretty well even on a map they didn't know. So that's where it ended. It was another 9th to 12th at the CPL. Now, unfortunately, after this tournament, Element famously left Game Online, and you had this weird scenario where he came back to his old teammates, a bunch of the players that had been playing at Spacebar with BSL, the guys like, I mean, obviously not at that particular time, Nikon, etc. Well, I mean, it would have initially been. So it was a bunch of the players from CatchGamer, and he basically took them and out goes BSL. He gets kicked. There was this dispute with the LAN cafe at the time and who had the sponsorship, etc. And Eolithic was made, and obviously went on to win CPL Oslo in their native Norway. And then later on, Element would leave again, and they'd become a team with Dark and Executor, and Element would go back to Game Online. And in amongst all of this, BSL was just pushed out. He was pushed out of the equation. He was gone for now. And he was left without a team. It looked like, what's he going to do? So interestingly, in 2003, the next year, BSL, who was something of a world traveler, he's a guy who'd like to go and experience lots of different things. Many years later, actually, he went and did that like Trans-Siberian Railroad where you go all the way from like over Russia to China or something crazy. It takes like 2 days or something. And at this period in time, in 2003, he went to Brazil. And he wanted to go there to live, to enjoy like the samba lifestyle, to have a fun time. And while he was over there, basically the guy who was in charge of MIBR got in contact with him and got him to agree to play with MIBR, the best Brazilian team. Now at the time, Brazil were nobody in professional Counter-Strike. They were never getting any top placings. Kogu hadn't actually emerged yet, so we didn't have the superstar player. We had some okay players there, but they didn't have any access except for going to the odd American CPL to get a sense of the meta. They couldn't practice anyone good, so they were just off in their own little area, and they weren't very developed. Now BSL coming in started to train these guys up as to how you play with a European tactical approach, what the meta of the game is, when to save, how to attack, how to use your star players. And initially he already got them to a decent level by the summer of this year. He got them to win the ESWC and CPL qualifiers, to go to those tournaments. At ESWC they were 9th to 12th. They had some okay games against some of the better teams, but still showed some immaturity in terms of professionalism, in terms of knowing how to play against those top teams in a LAN environment. At CPL Summer, they only managed to place top 16, but again, they did all right. Now, you could see the effect later on, because when BSL was gone from the lineup, having brought in the tactics and the understanding of the meta, the team did go on, by the time it came to the CPL at the end of the year, to crack top 5 there. They'd become a much better team. They had the connections to practice against the Adrenaline team of Vestlin and Executor and those guys, although Executor wasn't in the lineup when they actually practiced him. Now, when BSL went back to Europe, he had a bunch of different opportunities, because there wasn't really a Norwegian opportunity for him at this point in time. But he went initially to Denmark, actually. He was going to join SOA, Spirit of Amiga, a legendary clan name, and they were trying to rebuild the team. At this time, the best Danish team was a team called Level, which had a lot of the best teams in, and they'd kind of been the people who'd left and broken away from SOA. So they were brought in BSL thinking he can be a good in-game leader, he can be a captain. But actually, he wasn't there very long before he got the call, and he basically left them in the lurch, and he flew over to America to be part of this experimental team that the Gamers X organization was going to run, called NOA. And now the key thing is this was going to be the second team of this organization, because they were also funding Adrenaline. So Adren GX, remember, which was Vestland's team, which was basically the Team 9 squad that had won Click Arena and won ESWC, and now had got an Executor into the mix and placed second at CPL Summer. So they were the main squad, and they were going to fly over to America and live in the LA area and practice all the time at LAN cafes. So they brought in this second squad that was also going to play against them and was also going to have a chance. And this one was the experimental one, because it was BSL, and then it was 2 of his Norwegian teammates. It was Nikon and it was Knoxville, guys who'd been with him from Meredia. And then we had 2 North American players. We had Shagwar, the Canadian AWPer, and we had Method, a very skilled North American player. And they put together this lineup. And I think at the time, actually, Knoxville was the in-game leader of this time, of this era, if I remember correctly. But when they put this lineup together, it was like they had very difficult living situations. It was very touch and go as to whether this team would ever even be good. And what's very weird is their first big LAN actually wasn't a big one, but their first LAN was actually a qualifier for the CXG tournament, and they did kind of rocky at that tournament actually. They had a tough time playing against the team that would later become the rival team of next year, but at that time was just a mixed team of some good players from Forsaken and some West Coast players who played a lot of the SoCal, NorCal Pogs. And so coming into the CPL, they weren't expected to be very good. Off the top of my head, I think their seeding was something like 32nd seed. So that meant not only were they not expected to do well, but they had a very tough bracket route to get through. Now, famously, they had an epic run. Now, one of the big reasons why is they won tons of pistol rounds, a lot of pistol rounds. They also won some close games that they played at the tournament. And epically, they were able to beat out the likes of Adrenaline, the main team for the GX organization, and in the end finished second only to the SK Sweden team, which had Element in it, who were the best in the whole world. The Heaton and Potty lineup that was like very, very dominant and hadn't lost any land since they'd really gotten the lineup in place. And yes, they were able to beat NOA, but other than that, NOA had an amazing run. This was a miracle run. It looked like BSL's career had really been revived because now it was at its peak. It had never been better. Now, unfortunately, going into 2004, he was the player who got kicked. Now, it was famous in the Norwegian scene that they were very ruthless with their kicks. If they thought that someone just wasn't good enough or they could upgrade him, they would kick you in an instant. And so famously, even though the last big placing they'd had was second at the CPL, they decided to kick out BSL and they were able to get in Element. So admittedly, you can understand why they made that change. Element was arguably either the best or the most impactful player in the world. He was the captain of SK Sweden. They'd won everything. It was also bizarre that he'd leave in that scenario, but he wanted to go and play with his friends like Method. And he wanted to go play with the other Norwegians. And so BSL was kicked out, and again, he was left in the wilderness. Now, unfortunately, because he'd been more of a support player in that NOA team, people didn't really look at him like, oh, he's a top quality guy, we've got to pick him up. So initially, again, he went for a weird move. He was joining up actually with another Danish team. He joined with the Titans initially. And that was the team which was going to be, we know 2 or 3 months later, surprisingly would come out of nowhere, this Danish team, to actually win ESWC. Before that, that didn't really work out for BSL, and he went and joined this project called Team AMD Gamer. And this was where PC Gamer and AMD, the games magazine, and AMD, the processor company, combined to make an esports team, which was going to try and be the best in the UK and then be a top international team. Now, at the time, the best team in the UK obviously was Four Kings with Harriman and Dark and all those guys. Although actually at this point in time, I think, was Dark still playing at this point in time? No, he would have left by then because he obviously was in Neolithic later. So what happened was, this Team AMD Gamer, they obviously brought BSL in for his experience, and they were working with a lot of players who weren't top-level players. Like, they were mainly UK players, and then he had, like, Nirian from Sweden, who'd been in Gamers.nu. And this actually lineup was one of the worst that BSL was in, because it never really got its shit together. It never had any big placings. It didn't even win the UK lands that it went to. And actually, BSL didn't even play at the major with them. They had the Swedish player Zaffe come and play as a stand-in instead, and he wasn't able to. Now, that project ended up not really working out. He was gone from it. And at the end of 2004, he formed CatchGamer. Now, CatchGamer was a big community website that had like a premium component to it. And the initial lineup he formed was like a mix of like skilled but not elite level Norwegian players. So he had like some that were okay, like Juvenile and Day had some good performances in the past and been in good teams. But the rest of them, like Luke had a little brief period when he'd been good. He'd actually been for a short period of time in 9 Isu before they'd kicked him. And then they had some others that were known, and then they had a young player who was like a rising star called Jazam. And so it was hoped that BSL again could be, this time he's with Norwegian players again, he could bring in, be a good in-game leader, get a tactical style. Now the results were really up and down, and ultimately this era of CatchGamer wasn't that impressive really. I mean, initially they had like a really bad placing in Norway, then they went to CPL Turkey, which even though it sounds good, it was just one of the stops along the way, and it wasn't very good teams, and in narrow fashion they won the tournament, but it wasn't elite level teams they were beating at that time. It was mainly like Russians, etc. Now at this point in time they kicked out Luke, they kicked out a guy called Slick Silver, they brought in another young guy called Zevi. At this point, actually, BSL, as a personality, actually launched his own website. And the concept of his website was that you could pay to be a premium member, and he would give you access to all the photos he'd taken around the world and at gaming events, and he would post blogs and articles about his thoughts on things. It was quite a revolutionary idea, and I don't think that many people signed up. I mean, he'd have to tell you about that. So it wasn't super popular, but it was certainly a unique concept at the time. Now, with the new lineup, they went to CPL Spain, which is a pretty stacked event. They managed to get top 8 there, which was okay, but still nothing to suggest they're going to be a top team. The big result for this lineup came at the World Esports Games Season 2. So this was WEG, and it was the tournament that took place in Korea, and you used to go there for like a month and live there and play out the group stage and play in a studio. And then the whole thing is it would be more like how Korean esports are done, like in the GSL and StarCraft or the OSL or the ASL, where it takes a whole month, and therefore you got to prep for each team you're going to play and practice and prepare. It's not like a 3-day tournament, like especially at that point in time we were most famously used to in esports. Now at this tournament, the interesting thing is, even in the group stage, they didn't look like they were going to be that crazy. They lost to Gamerco, who had Dark standing in from this North American lineup that was mainly like Fear and Haynes and those guys. Maybe Haynes wasn't in that lineup actually, who were the guys from Rival, famously before that. And so they managed to lose to them in the first group stage. In the second group stage, they lost to Begrip, who was this young Swedish team who hadn't done anything yet, but we'll hear about them very soon. They managed to beat 4 Kings, who had Element standing in for them, this UK lineup. So obviously a nice bit of revenge for BSL that sense, because obviously with Tag, Team AMD Gamer, he hadn't managed to make them the #1 team in the UK, but now he'd beaten the #1 UK team, and with Element, his old teammate who'd always left him, obviously, and then even had him replaced in NOA. But in the final, they played against Begrip, and they lost here. Now, it was shocking enough that this team was able to make the final. Admittedly, not all the top Swedish teams were there, so it wasn't the best teams in the world. But losing to Begrip, this was a team that had Forest, Temple, and Roban before we knew who they were. These were no ones at the time, and obviously, Forest and Temple's big run, and in fact Roban's himself included, wouldn't really come until 2006 with Fnatic and NIP respectively. So this is one of the first big breakouts for them, but a good placing for BSL nonetheless. Back in the UK for CPL, he went back to an event in September. They managed to have a good placing there. They finished 3rd. Then he got his old mate Nikon to come over and join. Obviously, Nikon NOA had broken up at Season 2. After Season 2, Nikon comes over, joins in the team. They had an okay. They went to the World Cyber Games, but that was played in Source actually, and yet they'd let people qualify in 1.6, which sounded bizarre, and it was. So as a result, no one was really adapted to Source. They only placed top 16 there. Then they had a CPL event in Chile, which they went to, and they only placed 3rd because they lost to United 5. The event was won by MIBR. It wasn't a very tough field. This kind of shows that CatchGamer, especially this era, wasn't really that good. It was never elite level. It was like a good European team, and it could have moments that were good, but it wasn't really like a championship major winning level team or by any stretch of the imagination. And then the year ended with a CPL Winter Tournament, which was one of the most stacked ever, one of the majors, and they managed to actually impressively place 7th here. Like, despite the fact that in the first round of the upper bracket, they got shocked in overtime by the tech team that was Elude and a bunch of other guys, and then they went through this epic lower bracket run and managed to finish 7th overall, so pretty solid finish actually when you consider it. Now in 2006, at the beginning of the year, now is when things start to look up, because actually having a good placing, and the fact that the other good Norwegian team was Team 9, and that was Real and Oops and Zion and a bunch of the guys in PRB, and then Jungle's Bobo wasn't a very good player, admittedly, he was a support player. This young team from Norway had won CPL UK and beaten out all these top teams, NIP, SK, CatchGamer, all these great teams, and they'd won that tournament, but they were very, very young. Like, the star player was Real, the MVP of the team, and he was like 15 years old. And the team, because of sponsorship issues, had broken in half at the end of the year, and some of them, I think it was PRB and Zion, went over to join what was NOA and actually make like a Danish-Norwegian lineup. And BSL managed to get the real stars of the team at the time, which was Oops and Real, and get them to come over and join him in CatchGamer. So them joining the team, now you had some superstar firepower. And now people thought, right, mix of old school players, mix of the new school, this could be really dangerous. At Digilab in Norway, they didn't actually have a very good initial run because they did all right, but they lost to MIBR in the final. Now, interestingly enough, that's an interesting kind of, not really revenge story, but coming of age story for MIBR, because obviously BSL going over to Brazil in 2003 and teaching them how to play had been a big part of what had made that team better, but they hadn't had many big placings since then, since like 2004 onwards. And this run right here was a big one because not only did they beat BSL and CatchGamer, but yes, they had Kogu, who was already a superstar, but they didn't actually yet have the lineup which would go on the same year to win ESWC. This is actually just before that, and most of the players in this team weren't in the lineup that won ESWC except Kogu. Now, they had the Samsung European Championships was after that, not a good placing there for CatchGamer. They were quite underwhelming there. But they went to WEG Masters, and WEG was another season, but this time it was in China. It was in Hangzhou, China, and instead of being a month-long tournament, it was a few weeks long, and it was this one where they had a very stacked lineup of really good teams. They had Complexity, the team that won ESWC the year prior. They had the back-to-back CPL champions of SK Sweden, who'd won the CPL Winter, the last major of 2005. They had all these other teams, the best Korean team, they had the best Chinese team, who'd won the last season of WEG Season 3. They had all these top-quality sides. And CatchGamer was able to place top 4. In the group stage, they lost to WNV 2-1, the team that ended up winning the tournament, so they won a map off them. They beat SK Sweden, who at the time were considered the #1 ranked team in the world, the champions of CPL Winter, and famously, the first map, they 16-0'd them on Inferno, an epic win, and the second map was on Nuke, and when they won this second map, because they'd 2-0'd and 16-0'd in one of the maps, the world champions, this is the one where BSL, I'll link a video of it there, famously reacts by actually ripping his shirt off and throwing it in the crowd. And I have to say at the time, he wasn't in that great shape, and he had a bit of flab, but it was a classic moment anyway, and it kind of shows that he had a lot of personality as a player. Funnily enough, in his earlier days, in 2003 with Spacebar, he used to be known for wearing kind of like a Rasta hat, one of those multicolored ones that normally they put over where they have the dreads, you know, to bunch it up. So just a little detail there about how he showed off his persona, his personality. Now, they also managed to beat 4 Kings. Obviously, again, a bit of revenge over the team from when he was in tag. Now, that got them out of the group stage, and it was a top 4 playoffs type scenario. Unfortunately, in the semi-finals, they had to play Complexity, also one of the best teams in the world, and they managed to win a map, but lost the series overall. And then in the third place decided, they lost to Hacker Project, which is actually Project KR, Solo, and the Korean guys. Again, 3-map affair. So they potentially could have made the final, could maybe have placed 3rd. But ultimately, when you look at the teams there, 4th place seems like the right one overall, despite what great performance they had in the group stage, one of the tougher groups as well. Now, the rest of the time in CatchGamer was quite disappointing. I mean, they had a player like Real, a superstar player. Admittedly, he'd been ill actually at the event in Hangzhou, but you'd expect them to be able to do more, and unfortunately, they had some quite underwhelming results. That summer, they went to the big tournaments. They went to DreamHack Summer, and they only placed top 8. Now, admittedly, one of their losses, which was to Attacks, wasn't as bad as it seemed at the time, because Attacks that summer, the German team with Moon, etc., went on to be the best German team and one of the best teams in the whole world and placed very highly at the majors. But at the time, they hadn't had that big run yet, and so we didn't expect much from this. Looked like a very underwhelming loss. They managed to beat SK Sweden, which was solid enough, but then this was the killer, was they lost to Czech 6, which were the ex-ICSU guys, who are really an underdog team from Sweden, still would have only been ranked like, you know, 4th or 5th best Swedish team at the time, not that good. So that was kind of a killer to lose that badly. Then a few weeks later, they went to WSVG ISC, one of the majors of the year. Formerly it would have been CPL Summer, but this one was actually in the WSVG banner, and they only placed top 24. They got rocked out really early in the tournament. They lost again to Attack, so at least at this point in time had been in the let me think, had they been in the ESWC final? Yes, I think they had. I think didn't they win ESWC? No, that doesn't make sense. How could they have won ESWC? No, they must have placed top 4 at ESWC. I think that might be right. Because I think it was MIBR and Fnatic in the ESWC final. I think that sounds about right. But they were already better than CatchGamer at this time. And the big shocker, though, was losing to a United 5 team that wasn't very good in the lower bracket and just getting eliminated outright. Now, 2 weeks or so after this, BSL and Nikon decided to just retire from competitive play. They'd had long careers at this point in time, 4 or 5 years. They'd had chances at the top. This would be one of their big teams where it seemed like their last big chance. Salaried team, chance to fly everywhere, chance to go to a lot of big tournaments. And obviously this lineup had not worked out, and the others needed to leave anyway, the Reals, etc. of the world, and go and play elsewhere in their own teams. Now, in 2007, though, BSL made a very, very brief impromptu return to playing because he was going to the WEG, World Esports Games, E-Stars tournament in Seoul, Korea, to be a commentator actually for the event. But MIBR had a problem, which was their FNX, their second star, very young guy, had personality issues and missed a flight, didn't board it, and therefore the team came with 4 players and didn't have a 5th player. Now luckily, knowing BSL and him being at the event as a caster, they said, can you stand in and play these games with us? Now funnily enough, he hadn't played for quite a while competitively. The team actually did pretty well. They were able to tie X7 Hacker, which was the Chinese team, which was actually one of the teams that made the final. They were able to beat Istro, the top Korean team, who obviously was still known as a solid team, and they were able to tie Fnatic 1-1. At the time, Fnatic, this was part of their streak where they were the best team in the world, and admittedly they managed to get Dust 2, which is the team famously that Fnatic team used to always lose on. They managed to win a map against them, Dust 2, and go 1-1. So they didn't lose to any of the teams. Now, the very weird format meant that only the top 2 teams in the 4-team group got out, so it was actually Fnatic versus X7 Hacker in the final, and Fnatic won. So that was a very brief comeback. Then we saw BSL later in the year as part of CGS, Championship Gaming Series, where DirecTV hosted that big televised league where it was a franchise system where you had a GM of the franchise and you would have players in racing games, fighting games, beat 'em ups are fighting games, FPS, so you'd have Counter-Strike, you'd have FIFA, you had all these different games, and the point was your franchise competed against another. So it didn't matter if you won in Counter-Strike, it depended on what your scores were across all the games aggregated and the overall score of the franchises. Now, BSL was the general manager of one of the European teams. He was the general manager of the Berlin Alliance, who were obviously the German team, and one of the players he had in his source team actually was Fiflaren. Obviously, we now know him from his time in NIP years later, and he was a known source player at the time. The rest of the players not as well known. Now, in terms of the CGS, actually BSL's franchise had a pretty good run. They won the European finals the first year. Then when they got to the finals for the World Championship, in the individual competition of just Source, they managed to place top 4. Then in the World Championships, so the franchise system of all of them, they placed top 4 there again. In 2008, second season, they came second at the European finals, went to the World Championship, again placed top 4, didn't manage to win, obviously. Now, that was basically the end of his career in esports as a GM, so coach type figure, or as a player. But BSL was involved beyond that. He was a journalist during this time for GotFrag, and he was writing pieces. I mean, he wrote a couple of classic pieces, actually. One was about Khan, the fact that he was a good fragging in-game leader, and about what that said about him as a player. If I can find these pieces, I'll link them in the description box below. And then another one was a classic. This is a very good piece, because really only BSL was equipped to write this piece at the time, which was because he'd known Element, the guy from his whole career, since he was like a 15-year-old, first starting to compete, to watching him go from team to team and have great success and be in World Championship level teams and win majors, play second at majors. He'd seen this guy's whole career, and he wrote this classic piece charting Element's career and about what kind of like a weird personality he had, about how he just flipped from team to team no matter what success they were having, and about how even though he'd had this fantastic success, he retired quite young. He was just burned out after his mouse period, and retiring so young, he actually had kind of underachieved with his career because he was such a talented player, such a massive impact in the game. He could have won even more. He could have been one of the greatest winners of all time. So it's a really classic piece. Also, BSL became known for commentary. I mean, he casted with Red Eye actually at some World Cyber Games. I think it was 2009, the classic final again, and Fnatic. I think he also did the 2010 final, which was the Na'Vi versus MTW one. And as a player in his career, oh yeah, by the way, one last thing to mention, I've just remembered it, which is that for the last part of his career, BSL, from doing the commentary, also got to do the first ever major in CSGO, which is DreamHack Winter 2013. He was the desk host, and the analyst was me, who were doing my first ever analysis role job, and it was actually Sir Scoots was the analyst, who, by the way, will be the analyst at the Clash for Cash for E-League coming up soon. And I have to say, BSL actually, it was bizarre because he was someone who always had such a great personality as a caster, and he was always a very confident player, and he was great in interviews and had a lot of media training. And at this time, he's a professional journalist. But for some weird reason at this major, he did actually get very nervous. I'm not sure why. And he didn't really pull it off the way I know he wanted to. And I don't know why, but the pressure of it just seemed to get to him in some bizarre way, maybe because of the hosting aspect. It's actually a tough job to do if people have never done it before. And he didn't really do that well in that particular respect. I mean, if anyone remembers, he famously, because he didn't have that much to work with Scoots at the time, he had to just keep throwing to him saying, "You're an American, Scoots, you're American," which, yeah, that got a bit old quite soon, I have to say. Although, admittedly, Cole did go far. They came top 4. So, as a player, BSL was first and foremost an in-game leader. He was a guy who, in the early days, was one of the better in-game leaders, had a good tactical style, believed in the team system and putting people in their right roles, was certainly a thinker in terms of coming up with tactics, etc. Wasn't like on the level of an Element of an Executor, admittedly, because they were brilliant players and had almost preternatural skills as in-game leaders in particular respects, but certainly a very good in-game leader. And I think you could see that in his play because he was a cerebral player, actually. I mean, famously, when he was in NOA, he actually was very good at playing CT Ramp Room on Nuke, and they won a lot of Nuke games at that CPL Winter 2003 run. And despite not being such a skilled player and that being a tough spot to hold, he was very cerebral in terms of how he held it. I think him and Knoxville held that position together. Ironic, because you wouldn't think they would work together well, because Knoxville famously kept getting BSL cut from all of his teams, and he always had a weird rivalry with that guy, despite the fact they played together in a number of teams. Now, he's also known as an AWPer. Like, he wasn't a superstar AWPer, but he was a good AWPer, and he could use it within the context of being the tactical player. Obviously, he mainly used it on the CT side anyway. Now, because he was someone who was very open and a very social person, BSL also had a lot of interaction with the community. He's a guy who did a lot of interviews. He released a lot of POV demos in the early days. He actually had movies made. He famously made a movie himself called BSL from the Block that I'll link here, which, assuming it's on YouTube, which is a fantastic movie. It's very old now. It's used very simple editing techniques, but it's a great movie. It's a lot of fun, has some good kills in it. Later on, they made a Catch the Future movie about his CatchGamer team. He was a guy who was a very social, outgoing guy. He was one of those guys, along with Khan later, you had Lurpis, these guys, Vestlin, who the point was, within their teams, a lot of the teams, especially the Nordic regions, they'd just stay to themselves, speak their own language, not communicate in English much. They wouldn't do a lot of interviews. You'd always have the captain guy, would have to be the guy who learned the social skills and was willing to be outgoing and communicate with other teams to get us practices and boot camps and games and be able to be part of the wider world of the media aspect, which obviously has grown over the years. And he was very much ahead of the time in that sense. So in many ways, he was a legendary figure. He was around a long time in many different teams, in many different countries, and you can see how people from different countries wanted to bring him in as in-game leader because of his talents in that sense, and he did some great things in Counter-Strike, and so it'd be interesting to see how he returns now for ESL.
Hey guys, it's Fifth Lauren, also known as 944. Don't forget Thorin's YouTube channel.
Hey guys, this is Cully from CatchGamer.